It was a crisp fall morning in Los Angeles, and the stage was set for an interview that would soon become one of the most talked about moments in Hollywood. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and unapologetic conservative, was scheduled to sit down with Jackson Reed, a rising liberal reporter for the New York Herald. Reed had made a name for himself by challenging conservative figures, often baiting them into heated debates to generate viral content. Eastwood, however, was no ordinary guest. He had seen it all: Hollywood politics, media bias, and the shifting landscape of American values. At 94, he was as sharp as ever, with a reputation for being brutally honest and unshakably firm in his beliefs. Yet, despite his legendary career, he had always been a man of few words, preferring to let his films and actions speak for themselves. As Eastwood walked onto the set of the Herald interview, the studio buzzed with anticipation. Jackson Reed sat ready with his notepad, a confident smirk plastered across his face. He had spent days preparing for this interview, determined to paint Eastwood as outdated, out of touch, and irrelevant in today's progressive Hollywood. "Mr. Eastwood," Reed began, his tone laced with a subtle arrogance, "it's a pleasure to have you here." Eastwood, dressed in his signature rugged style, jeans, boots, and a leather jacket, simply nodded. "Pleasure's mine," he said coolly. Reed wasted no time. "You've been known for your conservative views, something that, let's be honest, doesn't align with the direction Hollywood is moving in today. Do you think your refusal to embrace progressive values has made you obsolete in the industry?" Eastwood leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Reed. "Son," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, "Hollywood's been trying to obsolete me for 50 years, but here I am, still making movies, still filling theaters, and still telling stories people want to see." Reed chuckled, trying to mask his discomfort. "Right, but let's talk about your views. You've spoken out against political correctness, against cancel culture, things that many people today see as necessary progress. Do you think you're stuck in the past?" Eastwood smirked, shaking his head. "No, I think I'm stuck in reality. The real world isn't a Twitter feed or a newsroom debate. It's people trying to live their lives without being told what to think or how to speak. I've lived long enough to see trends come and go, and I can tell you one thing: common sense always outlives hysteria." Reed's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance, but not this level of composed defiance. He decided to push harder. "Well, take something like toxic masculinity," Reed continued. "You've played tough, gritty characters your whole career: cowboys, soldiers, detectives. But today, many would argue that these portrayals contribute to a culture of aggression and oppression. Do you think your movies have had a negative impact on society?" A slow, knowing grin spread across Eastwood's face. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Let me ask you something, kid. You ever been in a real fight? Ever had to stand your ground, protect someone you love, or defend something you believe in?" Reed blinked, caught off guard. "Well, no, but then maybe you don't know what real masculinity is." Eastwood's voice remained steady, unwavering. "Toxic masculinity is a term people use when they don't understand what being strong, disciplined, and responsible actually means. The men I've played weren't perfect, but they stood for something. And let me tell you something else. People still watch those movies because they recognize something in them that's missing today." The studio was silent. Even the crew seemed transfixed by Eastwood's words. But Reed wasn't done yet. He had one more trick up his sleeve, one last attempt to corner the legendary actor. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," Reed said, forcing a smile. "Let's talk about the elephant in the room, your speech at the 2012 Republican National Convention. Many saw your empty chair act as bizarre, even embarrassing. Looking back, do you regret it?" Eastwood chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a damn bit," he said. "That empty chair was supposed to represent a president who wasn't doing his job. And judging by how things turned out, I'd say I wasn't too far off." Reed opened his mouth, but Eastwood wasn't finished. "You see, kid, when you live long enough, you learn that people remember the truth, even when they don't want to admit it. That speech ruffled feathers because it called out something real. And that's why I'm still here, Because I don't say what's popular, I say what needs to be said. Reed shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The interview was not going as planned. He had hoped to expose Clint Eastwood as a relic of the past, but instead he was the one struggling to keep up. And Eastwood knew it. The tension in the studio was palpable. Jackson Reed had spent his career dismantling conservative viewpoints with ease, yet here he was, struggling to keep control of the conversation. Clint Eastwood wasn't just answering his questions. He was dismantling them, brick by brick, with calm, unshakable confidence. But Reed wasn't ready to back down. He had one more angle, one he was sure would finally crack Eastwood's unflinching demeanor. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," Reed said, forcing a composed smile. "You talk about standing up for what you believe in, but let's address something that many find troubling. Your stance on diversity in Hollywood. In a time when the industry is pushing for more inclusivity, your films have been criticized for lacking representation. How do you respond to that?" Eastwood let out a slow exhale, his expression unreadable. He took a moment before responding, his voice measured but firm. "You know," he began, "people love to talk about representation like it's some kind of scorecard. But storytelling isn't about ticking boxes. It's about telling the truth. And the truth is, I've cast people from every background in my films, not because of their skin color or their gender, but because they were right for the role." Reed seized on the moment. "So you're saying Hollywood's push for diversity is misguided?" "I'm saying it's being done for the wrong reasons," Eastwood shot back. "I've been in this business for over 60 years, and I've worked with actors of every race, every nationality. But back then, we didn't cast people to fill quotas, we cast them because they could act. And the best actors, the best stories, will always find an audience, no matter what." Reed narrowed his eyes. "But don't you think Hollywood has a responsibility to reflect the diversity of America?" Eastwood leaned forward, locking eyes with Reed. "Hollywood's responsibility is to tell the best damn stories possible. Period. You don't create great films by forcing artificial representation. You do it by telling the truth. And the truth isn't always politically correct." The crew was dead silent. Reed shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "All right," Reed said, reaching for his next move. "Let's talk about politics. You've openly supported Republican candidates, and some people argue that this has hurt your legacy. Younger audiences, in particular, see you as out of touch. Does that concern you?" Eastwood chuckled. "Not even a little," he said. "You think I'm worried about what some 20-year-old on Twitter thinks? I've lived long enough to know that opinions change with the wind. What matters is what's real. And what's real is that I've built a career by telling stories people want to see, not by catering to the loudest voices in the room." Reed's frustration was growing. He had expected Eastwood to stumble, to struggle with modern political discourse. But instead, the legendary actor was running circles around him. "Fine," Reed said, masking his annoyance. "Let's talk about something even more relevant, cancel culture. You've criticized it before, but wouldn't you agree that holding people accountable for their words and actions is a good thing?" Eastwood smirked. "Accountability is one thing. Mob rule is another." Reed opened his mouth to interject, but Eastwood wasn't done. "You see, kid, I grew up in a time when a man's word meant something. If you had a problem with someone, you handled it face to face, not by digging up a tweet from 10 years ago and demanding they lose their job." Reed scoffed. "But what about people who've said or done harmful things? Shouldn't there be consequences?" "Of course," Eastwood said. "But consequences should come from real actions, not from some internet outrage machine. You've got kids today apologizing for jokes they made a decade ago. People losing their careers over things that weren't even controversial when they said them. That's not justice. That's cowardice." Reed was struggling now, grasping for something, anything, to regain control. But before he could find his next move, Eastwood leaned back in his chair and gave him a look that sent a chill down his spine. "You want to know the real reason people like me don't get canceled?" Eastwood asked, his voice low and steady. Reed hesitated. "Why?" "Because we don't apologize for telling the truth." The studio was silent. The crew members exchanged glances, barely able to process what they were witnessing. Reed was visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. He had come into this interview expecting to expose Clint Eastwood as an outdated relic of the past. Instead, he was the one struggling to keep up. Eastwood let the moment linger before finally speaking again. "You see, kid," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "Hollywood may change, the media may change, but the truth? That never changes. And the truth is, people are tired of being told what to think, what to say, and who to be. They want real stories, real heroes, not the ones made in boardrooms or designed to fit an agenda." Reed swallowed hard. He had never been so thoroughly outmatched in an interview before. And worse, he knew the internet was going to have a field day with this. Eastwood, meanwhile, simply leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed. He had faced bigger battles in his lifetime, and he knew one thing for sure: when the dust settled, the truth would still stand. Jackson Reed was rattled. His confidence, so evident at the start of the interview, had begun to erode under the weight of Clint Eastwood's unapologetic wisdom. The legendary actor wasn't just answering questions. He was exposing the flaws in the very arguments Reed had built his career on. But Reed wasn't ready to concede. Not yet. He straightened in his seat, trying to regain some composure. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," he said, forcing a smile. "You've certainly made your views clear, but let's talk about the future. Do you think your brand of storytelling, tough, gritty, and unapologetic, has a place in modern Hollywood? I mean, the industry has changed and audiences have changed with it. Don't you think it's time to adapt?" Eastwood chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, kid, people have been telling me to adapt for 50 years. First, they said westerns were dead. Then they said action movies were dead. Then they said nobody wanted stories about real men anymore." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And yet, here I am, still making movies, still telling stories people actually want to see." Reed nodded slowly, searching for an opening. "But let's be honest, Mr. Eastwood. Your kind of filmmaking, movies about strong, independent men who solve their problems through action, it's not exactly what Hollywood is pushing these days." A knowing smile spread across Eastwood's face. "You're right," he said simply. "Hollywood isn't pushing it, but the audience still wants it." Reed blinked, unsure of how to respond. "You see," Eastwood continued, "Hollywood has always been full of people who think they know what's best for the audience. But at the end of the day, the box office tells the real story. Look at the movies that people actually go to see. Action, adventure, grit, honor, sacrifice. The themes don't change, no matter how much Hollywood tries to pretend they do." Reed opened his mouth to argue, but Eastwood wasn't finished. "You know why my movies still work?" he asked, leaning forward. "Because they're about something real. People don't want lectures. They don't want to be told how to think. They want to escape. They want to see a story about a guy who stands up for what's right, even when the world tells him not to." Reed's frustration was mounting. He had come into this interview with a plan: to make Clint Eastwood look like a relic of the past. But the more Eastwood spoke, the clearer it became. He wasn't the one who was out of touch. It was Hollywood, and deep down Reed knew it. Still, he had one final card to play. "Okay, Mr. Eastwood," he said, keeping his voice even. "You've talked a lot about standing up for what you believe in. But what do you say to people who argue that your views on masculinity, on Hollywood, on cancel culture are dangerous? That they encourage a kind of resistance to progress?" Eastwood let out a low chuckle. "Dangerous?" he repeated. "You know what's dangerous, kid? A world where people are afraid to speak their minds. A world where saying the wrong thing can cost you your career. A world where young men are taught that being strong, independent, and self-reliant is something to be ashamed of." Reed swallowed hard. He hadn't expected Eastwood to go on the offensive. "You want to talk about progress?" Eastwood continued, his voice calm but firm. "Progress isn't about tearing down the past. It's about learning from it. And the problem with people like you is that you don't want to learn, you want to erase. You want to pretend that history never happened, that men like me never existed." Reed shifted in his seat, his confidence cracking. "But guess what? Eastwood said, his voice almost amused. You can't erase the truth. And the truth is, the reason people like me still exist, the reason our stories still matter, is because deep down, people want to be inspired. They want to believe that no matter how crazy the world gets, there's still room for honor, for courage, for standing up for what's right. Reed was silent. He had no response. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. He had seen men like Reed before, young, arrogant, convinced that they were on the right side of history. But history had a funny way of humbling people. And today, history had humbled Jackson Reed. The tension in the studio had reached its peak. Jackson Reed had started this interview with confidence, believing he would expose Clint Eastwood as a relic of the past. Instead, he was the one on the defensive. The old gunslinger hadn't just held his ground. He had turned the tables, forcing Reed to confront the uncomfortable reality that Hollywood's so-called progress wasn't as universally accepted as he had assumed. But Reed had one last chance to regain control. He took a deep breath, forcing a composed expression. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," he said carefully. "You've made it clear that you don't care about Hollywood's changing values. But let me ask you something. If a young filmmaker came to you today and said they wanted to make movies like yours, tough, masculine, no-nonsense films, what advice would you give them?" Eastwood's face remained unreadable. "I'd tell them the same thing I've told every filmmaker who's ever asked me for advice," he said. "Tell the truth." Reed frowned. "That's it. That's it," Eastwood said simply. "You see, kid, Hollywood likes to pretend that storytelling has changed. But it hasn't. Not really. Audiences don't care about the politics behind a movie. They care about whether it's a damn good story." Reed tilted his head. "So you don't think modern Hollywood is capable of telling good stories anymore?" Eastwood smirked. "Oh, they're capable. But they're too scared. Scared of offending the wrong people. Scared of making something that doesn't check the right boxes. Scared of telling a story that actually challenges people instead of just making them comfortable." Reed leaned forward slightly, sensing an opportunity. "So you're saying political correctness is ruining movies?" "I'm saying fear is ruining movies," Eastwood corrected. "Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of getting labeled. Fear of standing up for what you believe in." He shook his head. "You know, back in my day, directors didn't worry about whether their movie was politically correct. They worried about whether it was good." Reed's fingers tightened around his notepad. "But don't you think it's a good thing that Hollywood is more inclusive now? That more voices are being heard?" Eastwood shrugged. "More voices is fine. But forcing stories to fit a political agenda? That's not storytelling. That's propaganda." Reed felt his patience wearing thin. "So you're saying you don't think there's any value in diversity?" Eastwood's eyes locked onto him. "I'm saying real diversity isn't about what people look like. It's about what they think. And right now, Hollywood only allows one way of thinking." Reed blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. "The problem isn't that Hollywood is changing," Eastwood continued. "The problem is that Hollywood doesn't allow debate. They don't want different ideas. They want obedience. And that's why audiences are tuning out." Reed was silent. He had no counterargument. Eastwood sat back, completely relaxed. He had seen enough interviews like this to know exactly what had happened. Reed had come in expecting to control the conversation. But in the end, it was Eastwood who had dictated the terms. After a long pause, Reed cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Eastwood, I think we've covered quite a bit today. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up?" Eastwood smiled, his expression as sharp as ever. "Yeah," he said. "Hollywood can keep pretending that men like me don't matter anymore. But at the end of the day, the audience decides what matters. And no matter how much they try to change the rules, the truth always wins." Reed swallowed hard. He knew in that moment that this interview would go viral, but not for the reasons he had hoped. Clint Eastwood had walked in as a legend, and he had walked out as the man who had just humiliated Jackson Reed on his own show. The interview was over, but the impact was just beginning. As Clint Eastwood stood up from his chair, he gave a polite nod to the crew, as if nothing significant had happened. But Jackson Reed knew better. He could feel it in the air. This wasn't just another interview. This was a reckoning. Reed sat frozen in his seat as Eastwood casually walked off the set, his signature no-nonsense aura leaving a lingering presence behind. The studio crew exchanged glances, some suppressing smirks, others trying to act neutral. But the truth was undeniable. Eastwood had dominated the conversation, leaving Reed flustered and exposed. As soon as Eastwood left the building, Reed's producer rushed over, eyes wide with barely contained panic. "Jackson," she hissed. "What the hell just happened?" Reed rubbed his temples. "I don't know. He just flipped everything on me." "You think?" she shot back. "That man just turned your interview into a masterclass on why Hollywood is losing touch with its audience. Do you know what's going to happen when this airs?" Reed gulped. He did, and he was right. Within hours of the interview going live, social media erupted. The hashtag Clint owns the media was trending worldwide. Clips of Eastwood's responses were circulating everywhere, racking up millions of views on YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. Conservative commentators hailed Eastwood's performance as a devastating takedown of Hollywood's political elitism. Even some liberals admitted begrudgingly that he had made some valid points. Memes flooded the internet. One showed Eastwood sitting calmly while Reed fumbled with his notes, captioned, "Clint Eastwood doesn't debate, he teaches." Another had a side-by-side image. On the left, a smug Reed at the start of the interview. On the right, a visibly shaken Reed at the end. The caption, "You come at the king, you best not miss." Even major news outlets couldn't ignore the viral moment. Fox News ran a segment titled, "Clint Eastwood Schools Liberal Reporter on Hollywood's Hypocrisy." Meanwhile, CNN begrudgingly acknowledged that Eastwood's interview had sparked an important debate about the direction of the film industry. But the biggest blow came from the New York Herald itself. Inside the offices of the New York Herald, executives were panicking. The interview had been meant to challenge Clint Eastwood, to paint him as outdated. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had exposed Jackson Reed as arrogant, unprepared, and out of touch with the audience. Calls started coming in. Advertisers were worried about backlash. Subscribers were canceling, accusing the publication of being out of sync with the American people. Even some of Reed's colleagues were distancing themselves, embarrassed by how badly he had handled the interview. By the next morning, Reed's editor called him into a private meeting. "Jackson," he said, sighing as he slid a copy of the New York Herald across the desk. The front page wasn't kind. "Reed humiliated in disaster interview with Clint Eastwood." Reed swallowed hard. "Look, I can fix this," he said, scrambling. "Maybe we do a follow-up piece. Spin it as a learning experience." The editor shook his head. "Damage is done. People are calling for your resignation. Hell, the board is talking about making changes at the top." He leaned forward, voice serious. "You made us look weak. Worse, you made Eastwood look right." Reed had no response. He knew it was over. By the end of the week, Jackson Reed was forced to issue a statement announcing his departure from the New York Herald. Officially, it was labeled a mutual decision, but everyone knew the truth. He had been canceled by the very culture he once championed. As for Clint Eastwood, he went back to doing what he always did, living life on his terms. While Hollywood insiders continued to bicker about political correctness and representation quotas, Eastwood quietly began work on another film. It was a story about an aging cowboy who refused to bow to the pressures of a changing world. Some insiders joked that the film was autobiographical, but Eastwood didn't care, because in the end he knew one thing: no matter how much the world changed, the truth always outlived the noise. And so did Clint Eastwood.